Ladies and gentlemen, here is a truth most people are not ready to hear. Pushing an empath too far does not destroy the empath, it destroys the narcissist. We are taught that empathy makes someone vulnerable, that kindness can be exploited forever, and that silence means defeat. But what if the opposite is true? What if the moment the empath stops explaining, stops reacting, and stops trying to save the connection is the moment everything collapses? Tonight, I want you to listen closely, because this is not about blame or drama. It's about power, awareness, and the quiet point where compassion turns into self-respect, and nothing ever returns to how it was before. The idea that an empath's kindness is mistaken for weakness comes from a surface-level understanding of human strength. Many people believe strength must be loud, dominant, or forceful, so when they encounter someone who is gentle, patient, and emotionally open, they assume that person lacks power. But kindness, especially in an empath, is not passive or accidental. It is a conscious choice made again and again, often in situations where reacting harshly or walking away would be easier. That choice requires emotional discipline, self-control, and deep inner awareness. An empath feels everything more intensely than most people. They sense shifts in mood, unspoken pain, and emotional undercurrents that others ignore. Choosing kindness while carrying that level of emotional input is not weakness, it is restraint. It means the empath is strong enough to absorb emotional weight without becoming cruel, defensive, or numb. They do not lash out because they cannot, they hold back because they can. That restraint is power under control. This is why narcissists miscalculate empaths so badly. They see patience and think it means there are no limits. They see forgiveness and assume it will always be available. They see understanding and believe it cancels accountability. What they fail to recognize is that an empath's kindness is governed by values, not fear. It is guided by empathy, not submission. An empath stays calm not because they are powerless, but because they are grounded. They listen not because they are inferior, but because they are emotionally intelligent. Their softness is not a lack of strength, it is strength refined. Just like water that shapes stone not by force, but by consistency, the empath's kindness carries quiet authority. The danger lies in underestimating this discipline. When kindness is pushed beyond respect, the empath does not break. They shift. And when they shift, the very restraint that once protected the relationship becomes the force that ends it. And this is where the second truth reveals itself, almost unnoticed at first. The narcissist does not operate from real power. What they rely on is control. Control over reactions, over emotions, over attention. And that control only exists as long as the empath remains engaged, explaining, hoping, absorbing. The moment you understand the discipline behind an empath's kindness, you also begin to understand how fragile the narcissist's position truly is. Control feels like power to someone who has never developed inner stability. The narcissist learns early that if they can provoke a response, they can steer the relationship. If they can confuse, guilt, or destabilize the empath emotionally, they can stay on top without ever having to grow. So they test boundaries subtly. A small insult masked as a joke, a sudden withdrawal of affection, a shift in tone designed to create anxiety. None of it is random. It is all about maintaining leverage. What the narcissist doesn't realize is that this control is borrowed, not owned. It depends entirely on the empath's willingness to care, the empath's patience, their desire to understand. Their habit of giving the benefit of the doubt becomes the very fuel that keeps the narcissist feeling powerful. Without that emotional investment, the narcissist has nothing to grip. This is why control begins to crumble the moment the empath's awareness grows. When the empath recognizes patterns instead of excuses, control loses its magic. When they stop over-explaining, the narcissist loses their script. When the empath no longer reacts on cue, the narcissist feels something unfamiliar and terrifying, irrelevance. True power is stable. It doesn't need constant reactions to survive. Control does. And once the empath starts pulling their emotional energy back, even slightly, the narcissist senses the shift. Their tactics intensify, not because they are strong, but because they are afraid of losing the only thing that ever made them feel powerful in the first place. As control begins to weaken, something else quietly takes shape beneath the surface, something the narcissist never believes will happen. Every empath has a limit, not a dramatic breaking point filled with shouting or chaos, but a calm inner moment where clarity replaces confusion. It arrives after countless small dismissals, broken promises, and emotional negotiations the empath never wanted to make in the first place. The narcissist assumes that because the empath has endured so much, they will endure forever. That assumption is the most costly mistake of all. The empath's breaking point is not about anger, it is about exhaustion of the soul. It is the moment they realize they have been carrying the relationship alone. The moment they see that no amount of patience will inspire accountability, and no amount of love will teach empathy to someone who feeds on control. This realization does not explode outward. It turns inward. The empath grows quiet, observant, and emotionally distant long before they ever leave. This is where the narcissist misreads the situation completely. They interpret the empath's silence as victory. They believe the lack of confrontation means submission has been achieved. In reality, the empath is no longer fighting because they are no longer invested. Emotional energy begins to withdraw, not as punishment, but as self-preservation. Once this inner line is crossed, nothing can restore the old dynamic. The empath does not forget what they have seen. Patterns cannot be unseen. Trust does not return once it has been replaced by awareness. The empath's heart shifts from hope to self-respect, and that shift is irreversible. This is the moment the power dynamic truly changes. The narcissist still reaches for control, but it no longer lands. The empath's reactions fade, their explanations stop, and their emotional presence thins. What the narcissist experiences as sudden loss is actually the final stage of a process that has been quietly unfolding all along. And it is right here, in this quiet withdrawal, that the narcissist's downfall truly begins. Not when the empath finally speaks up, not when they threaten to leave, but when they stop absorbing what was never theirs to carry. For so long, the empath acted like an emotional sponge, soaking up blame, tension, and unresolved pain in an effort to keep the peace. They internalized the chaos, believing that if they were more patient, more understanding, more loving, things would change. But once the empath reaches that inner limit, something fundamental shifts. They no longer take responsibility for the narcissist's moods, reactions, or emotional storms. The insults stop sinking in. The guilt no longer sticks. The manipulation that once caused anxiety now feels transparent and oddly distant. What used to hurt deeply now barely registers, and that absence of impact is devastating for someone who relies on emotional reactions to feel in control. The narcissist senses this immediately. Their words don't land the same way. Their tactics feel ineffective. The empath is still physically present but emotionally unavailable. And this is far more unsettling than open conflict. Anger can be managed, tears can be exploited, but indifference offers no leverage at all. As the empath stops absorbing the abuse, the narcissist is forced to face something they have avoided their entire life, their behavior without a buffer. There is no one left to soften the consequences, to reinterpret cruelty as misunderstanding, to excuse harm as stress or insecurity. The narcissist's actions begin to echo back to them without distortion. This is when panic sets in, control slips faster, the attempts to provoke become more desperate, more obvious, but the empath has already stepped out of the role assigned to them. They are no longer the emotional shock absorber. They are no longer the stabilizing force holding everything together. And without that force, the narcissist's carefully maintained illusion of dominance starts to collapse from the inside out. As that illusion collapses, the narcissist begins to notice something that feels almost impossible to them. The empath, the one who gave endlessly, does not just give less. They stop giving altogether. And this is where the shift becomes final. Empaths do not withdraw in pieces. They do not leave one foot in the door. When they reach this stage, they pull their energy back completely, not out of spite, but out of clarity. For a long time, the empath believed love meant staying, fixing, enduring. They belie. Believed walking away meant failure or abandonment. But once self-awareness replaces self-blame, their definition of love changes. Love becomes safety. Love becomes mutual respect. Love becomes choosing peace over chaos. And once that realization settles in, the empath no longer negotiates their worth. This is deeply destabilizing for the narcissist. They were accustomed to second chances, long conversations, emotional access, even after harm. They assumed the empath would always return, always explain, always reopen the door. But what they never understood is that the empath's depth is matched by their finality. When an empath closes a door, it is not slammed. It is locked quietly, deliberately, and permanently. The withdrawal is not dramatic. There are no speeches, no final confrontations, just distance, just silence where emotional availability once lived. And that silence is not empty. It is full of resolve. The empath is no longer reachable in the way they once were. Their empathy has turned inward, toward healing instead of sacrifice. This complete withdrawal removes the last illusion the narcissist clings to, the belief that they still matter emotionally. They may still provoke, accuse, or attempt to reinsert themselves, but the connection is gone. The empath is no longer feeding the dynamic. What remains is a calm detachment that cannot be manipulated. And for the narcissist, that is the most unbearable loss of all. When that emotional connection is gone, the full reality of the narcissist's dependence begins to surface. Narcissists do not generate their own sense of worth from within. They survive on emotional supply, the reactions, attention, validation, and engagement of others. For a long time, the empath was that source. Their care, their concern, their willingness to engage even in pain kept the narcissist feeling significant and in control. Once the empath withdraws completely, that supply is cut off. And without it, the narcissist begins to unravel. They may appear confident on the surface, but underneath, there is a growing emptiness. The energy they once drew from the empath's reactions no longer exists. Silence replaces stimulation. Detachment replaces emotional fuel. And this absence is deeply destabilizing for someone who has built their identity around external validation. This is why narcissists often escalate when they feel an empath pulling away. The sudden lack of response feels like starvation. They reach out not because they miss the empath as a person, but because they miss how the empath made them feel powerful. When that feeling disappears, panic follows. The empath, however, is no longer participating in the cycle. They are not withholding to punish. They are protecting themselves. They have learned that their emotional energy is valuable, and they are no longer willing to give it to someone who consumes without giving back. This quiet self-respect becomes a boundary the narcissist cannot cross. Without emotional supply, the narcissist is left with their own internal emptiness, something they have spent a lifetime avoiding. The masks crack. The charm fades. Their sense of control weakens because there is no longer anyone reflecting their false image back to them. Meanwhile, the empath begins to stabilize. Freed from constant emotional extraction, they regain clarity, strength, and peace. What once drained them now has no access. And in that absence, the narcissist's downfall accelerates, not through attack, but through starvation of the very energy they depended on to survive. As that emotional supply disappears, something unexpected happens. The empath does not replace it with anger. They do not chase justice through confrontation. Instead, they choose silence, boundaries, and detachment. And his is where the impact deepens, because nothing unsettles a narcissist more than realizing they no longer have access. Silence is often misunderstood as weakness. But in this context, it becomes a language the narcissist cannot manipulate. When the empath stops explaining, there is nothing to twist. When they stop reacting, there is nothing to provoke. When they stop defending themselves, there is no argument to win. The narcissist, who once controlled the emotional rhythm of the relationship, suddenly finds themselves speaking into a void. Boundaries follow naturally, not loud ultimatums or dramatic declarations, but firm internal decisions. The empath decides what they will no longer tolerate, and they enforce it quietly. They answer less, they engage less. They no longer rush to fix misunderstandings that were never misunderstandings at all. These boundaries are not punishments, they are protections. And because they are calm and consistent, they cannot be negotiated or worn down. Detachment is the final shift, and it is the most painful for the narcissist to witness. Detachment means the empath is no longer emotionally invested in outcomes. Praise no longer inflates. Criticism no longer wounds. The narcissist loses their ability to regulate themselves through the empath's reactions. And that loss creates a kind of emotional free fall. What makes this especially devastating is that silence, boundaries, and detachment leave no visible enemy. There is no fight to fuel the narcissist's sense of importance. No dramatic conflict to frame themselves as the victim or the hero. Just absence, just neutrality, just calm. To the narcissist, this feels like erasure. They are used to being central, even if that centrality comes through chaos. Detachment removes that role entirely. The empath is no longer emotionally present enough to be controlled, yet not hostile enough to be attacked. This leaves the narcissist with nowhere to land. Meanwhile, the empath begins to feel lighter. Their nervous system calms, their thoughts clear. What once felt confusing now feels obvious. They realize that peace was always available. It just required stepping out of the emotional storm. And in that quiet clarity, the empath unknowingly delivers the deepest wound of all. Not rejection, not revenge, but the undeniable message that the narcissist no longer has power over their inner world. From that calm detachment, a deeper transformation unfolds, one that happens quietly and cannot be reversed. This is the empath's awakening. It does not announce itself. There is no dramatic declaration, no sudden shift in personality. It begins internally, with awareness settling into the body like truth finally being accepted instead of argued with. The empath starts to see clearly, not just the narcissist's behavior, but their own patterns of overgiving, overexplaining, and self-abandonment. What once felt like confusion now feels like recognition. They understand that love should not require constant self-erasure, and compassion should never demand suffering as proof of loyalty. This awareness is gentle, but it is absolute. What makes this awakening so powerful is its quiet certainty. The empath no longer debates their reality. They no longer seek validation for what they experienced. They trust themselves again. And that trust changes everything. Decisions become easier. Boundaries feel natural instead of forced. Silence no longer feels like loss, but like relief. To the narcissist, this awakening is invisible at first. They sense the emotional distance, but they do not grasp its permanence. They may believe this phase will pass, that the empath will eventually return to old patterns. But awakening does not fade. Once an empath understands the cost of staying disconnected from themselves, they cannot unlearn it. This is why the empath's calm becomes so unsettling. There is no bitterness to exploit, no emotional chaos to reignite. The empath is no longer driven by fear of abandonment or the need to be understood. They are anchored in self-respect. Their energy feels different because it is no longer available for manipulation. The narcissist may escalate, trying to provoke a reaction, but the empath's awakening acts like an internal shield. They observe without absorbing, they hear without internalizing. They remain steady where they once would have collapsed inward. And in this quiet, grounded presence, the empath steps fully out of the old dynamic, not loudly, not aggressively, but completely. And that completeness is what makes the awakening irreversible. As this awakening settles in, empathy itself begins to transform. It does not disappear, it matures. What once flowed outward without protection now turns inward with intention. The empath does not stop caring, but they stop sacrificing themselves to prove that they do. And this is where empathy evolves into something the narcissist can no longer access: self-respect. Self-respect changes the rules completely. It means the empath no longer negotiates their boundaries for emotional approval. They no longer confuse understanding with excusing harm. They recognize that compassion without limits becomes self-betrayal, and they refuse to participate in that cycle again. This shift is not fueled by resentment, but by clarity. When empathy turns into self-respect, access is revoked. The narcissist can no longer reach the empath's emotional core. They may still attempt to re-enter through guilt, nostalgia, or sudden kindness, but the empath sees these moves clearly now. What once felt confusing now feels predictable, and predictability removes power. This is especially stabilizing because the narcissist depended on emotional access, not connection. They relied on the empath's availability, their openness, their willingness to feel deeply even when it hurt. But self-respect closes that door without hostility. It doesn't argue. It doesn't explain. It simply says, internally and firmly, this no longer has permission. The empath does not need to announce this change. Their energy communicates. Conversations become shorter. Emotional engagement becomes minimal. The empath is polite, calm, and unreachable at the same time. And this combination is deeply frustrating for someone who once fed on emotional intensity. What the narcissist experiences as rejection is actually inaccessibility. The empath has moved beyond the reach of manipulation because they no longer offer their inner world as an open space. Their empathy now includes themselves, and that inclusion is non-negotiable. This is the point of no return. The narcissist may feel anger, panic, or disbelief, but none of it changes the outcome. Once self-respect takes root, the empath cannot be pulled back into the old dynamic. The emotional door is not slammed in rage, it is closed in peace. And peace, to someone who survives on chaos and control, is the one thing they cannot penetrate. And this is where the story comes to its quiet, undeniable truth. The narcissist does not fall because the empath attacks, exposes, or seeks revenge. There is no dramatic showdown, no public unraveling orchestrated by the empath's hand. The narcissist falls because the empath leaves. Fully, internally, permanently. Leaving does not always mean walking out the door. Sometimes it means emotional absence. Sometimes it means indifference where devotion once lived. Sometimes it means the empath's attention no longer follows the narcissist's moods, words, or crises. And that absence is not passive. It is decisive. It signals the end of access. For the narcissist, this is devastating because their sense of self was never self-generated. It was reflected back through the empath's care, concern, and emotional investment. When that mirror disappears, the narcissist is left facing themselves without distortion. There is no audience to impress, no energy to absorb, no emotional anchor to stabilize them. The emptiness they spent a lifetime avoiding rises to the surface. The empath does not need to witness this collapse. In fact, they rarely do. Their focus has shifted inward toward rebuilding a life that feels calm, safe, and aligned. They rediscover joy that does not come with anxiety attached. They form connections that do not require self-erasure. They begin to trust their intuition again, and that trust becomes the foundation of their future. What makes this ending so powerful is its simplicity. The empath's departure does not punish the narcissist, it reveals them. Without someone to manage the emotional fallout, the narcissist's patterns become obvious to others, and more importantly, to themselves. Control loses its target, manipulation loses its effect, the cycle collapses under its own weight. Meanwhile, the empath's life expands. Their nervous system heals, their energy returns. They no longer live in reaction mode. They live in presence, and that presence attracts peace instead of chaos. This is the ultimate downfall, not because the narcissist is defeated, but because they are no longer central to anyone's inner world. They are left behind by someone who finally chose themselves. And in that choice, the empath does not become harder or colder. They become whole. They walk away not in anger, but in clarity, not in revenge, but in freedom. And that quiet exit is the ending no narcissist ever survives. If you have stayed with me until this moment, it is. Because something in this story is not just information to you, it is recognition. Somewhere in these words, you saw yourself. You felt the weight of giving too much, the exhaustion of trying to hold everything together, and the quiet hope that maybe one day it would finally make sense. And now it does. The truth is, you were never weak for caring. You were never foolish for staying. You were never broken for believing in someone who could not meet you where you stood. Your empathy was real. Your love was real. And the pain you carried was not proof of failure, it was proof of depth. But here is what matters most. You are allowed to stop. You are allowed to choose peace over explanation. You are allowed to walk away without convincing anyone that your reasons are valid. Healing does not require permission, and freedom does not need an audience. This is not a story about defeating someone else. It is a story about returning to yourself. About remembering that your energy is sacred, your presence is powerful, and your heart deserves safety, not survival mode. When you stop pouring into someone who drains you, you do not lose love. You make room for it. So as this video comes to an end, I want you to hold on to this one truth. The moment you choose yourself, everything changes. Not all at once, not loudly, but deeply and permanently. Your calm becomes your power. Your boundaries become your protection, and your absence becomes the lesson you never had to teach. Stay with this awareness. Carry it forward. Let it guide how you love, how you give, and how you protect your peace. Because the strongest thing an empath ever does is stop abandoning themselves. And when you do that, you don't just survive the story. You finally become free from it.